Everyone. We're so glad that you've joined us today. I know things are busy for everyone, so I'm so happy that all of you took the time out of your days to join us for what will be a wonderful talk. My name is Professor Ethel Tunggohan. I am an assistant professor at the Department of Politics, a Canada Research Chair in Canadian Migration Policy, Impacts and Activism, and also a member of the executive for the Global Labor Research Center. First, I want to acknowledge that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede its establishment. We acknowledge that the area known as the Toronto has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many Indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish of One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Because we are not gathered in the same space, York's land acknowledgement may not represent the territory that you are currently on. I ask that you each take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are on and its current treaty holders, to remind ourselves of the responsibility we have to care for the land, all living things on the land, and our relationships with them. Welcome to this fourth panel in our 5-part series. And this panel will specifically be about worker struggles. This series is organized by John Clarke, the Packer Visitor in Social Justice at York University, and is co-hosted by the GLRC, the Global Labor Research Center, and the Department of Politics at York University. This series is dedicated to Leo Panitch, who passed away in December of 2020. Professor Panitch has made countless contributions to the study of social justice and left politics. His loss is felt by many of us. He was a friend, a mentor, and an ally, and he was always such a big supporter of the GLRC. The Packer Visitor in Social Justice is funded through the KH and W.A. Packer Endowment in Social Justice in the memory of Professor William A. Packer, who with his wife Catherine gave York University a generous endowment in support of social justice endeavors. We also want to thank the York University Staff Association for their generous support for this series. So a few technical instructions before we begin. There will be a live captioning. There won't be a chat box, but questions can be put in the Q&A section, and John will read questions and group them together and direct them to our esteemed panelists. Without further ado, I now turn it over to John. I think you're muted, John.
Sorry, I always promise myself I won't do that. Welcome everybody, and thanks to Ethel, and thanks to this particular panel, which I think covers an area of enormous importance, that of worker struggles. We're going to approach it from various perspectives. We have 3 speakers, and I will introduce each in turn before they speak. They will speak for up to 20 minutes, and then we'll take the questions. I would urge people to get questions in as soon as you can, so that we have a nice, interesting range of speakers we have a nice, interesting range of questions when the speakers finish. So without further ado, let's begin the panel. And we're first going to ask Gabrielle Aladoir, who is an organizer with Justice for Migrant Workers. And Gabrielle came as a migrant worker from St. Lucia. And he will speak about how COVID has exposed all migrant workers to vulnerabilities here in Canada during the pandemic.
Thank you so much. Special greetings to each and everyone in Zoom land today. Thanks for allowing me into your home. I want to start off with this here. I'm pretty sure we are encouraged to stay home, and I'm pretty sure this activity today is virtual. Why? Because of COVID, we're encouraged to stay home. And by staying home, are we not concerned where our food is coming from? How reliable is our food supply? I'm pretty sure you're concerned. So what brought me to Canada is the farm program, which I'll be talking a little about. But let me do a quick health check, because for the past 54 years, we've been providing you with food. But because of COVID, and we've been encouraged to stay home, let us do a quick health check. In school, I was taught, I'm pretty sure you learned the same thing, that our body is made up of 11 systems, right? Let me see, let us do a quick health check. Let me see if the food that farm workers have been providing you with over the years, and especially during COVID, whether they've been able to keep you healthy. I have SS. Is your skeletal system healthy today? If not, please let me know so that we can improve the quality of our food. Your CS, your circulatory system, have you been able to exercise and keep your blood fluid freely, nicely? MS, muscular system, how are you able to exercise or are you able to keep your body fit or, keep your muscles moving? IS, your immune system, how healthy is that? And with COVID and everything, and good health, well-being, our immune system is extra important. So I don't have time to go through the others, but I hope that the food that farm workers have been providing you with is able to keep you healthy. So what brought me to Canada? A couple of things. In my home country, red and white means love. And me personally, I felt the love of Canada in my home country on 2 great occasions. And I can never stop thanking Canada for being so good to me. And one of those 2 occasions, between 1986 and 1989, Canada allowed me to complete a secondary school education in my home country. The quality of my life has been impacted greatly by these 3 years that I spent completing a secondary school education. That is so because during that time, 1986 to 89, and after that, and we had very limited school places in my home country. Thanks to a gift by the government and people of Canada of a secondary school, I was able to get a spot to complete a secondary school education. During that time, the way the information is presented during those 3 years is Canada is not just a country. Canada is a standard. Canada is a standard. Canada, people from around the world, they look up to Canada for standards. Talking about that, I will decide whether I'll punish each and every one of you or whether I would reward each and every one of you, because you never told me about the injustices that migrant workers face, the conditions that migrant workers face in Canada. Every time I see a leaf, I think of a green leaf. In school, we were taught that the green leaves are the natural factories where our food are being synthesized due to photosynthesis. But red in my home country means danger. When I see a red leaf, it reminds me of the injustices, the dangers that migrant workers face, migrant farm workers face in the production of your food. And that is what COVID really exposed. According to somebody said, COVID exposed Canada's dirty secret. And that's what I want to talk about. And let me see if I can expose it a little. The program that brought me to Canada is like a telephone number. The program that brought me to Canada is like a tree. Have you ever seen a tree and a telephone number together? Only Canada have said that. Let me see. The first number in my telephone number is 54. The program that brought me to Canada, this year it's 54 years. The program that brought me to Canada, it also has free in the telephone number. And what does that free mean? The free simple parts of the tree. The free simple parts of that tree. The program that brought me to Canada is the seasonal agricultural workers program. What are the free simple parts of the tree? The stem, the branches, the leaves. I am in Canada. Migrant farm workers are in Canada because of the stem. What is the stem? What is that first pillar of that program? To do jobs Canadians do not want to do. And what are the jobs Canadians do not want to do? And look at it, due to COVID, I think you would agree with me that unemployment is at its highest in Canada after so many years. So many people have lost their jobs. So I was expecting Canadians who were unemployed to go to the farms and produce food. But what is happening? At 1 minute, the Prime Minister announced that the borders are closed, open only to citizens and permanent residents. It didn't take him long to open the doors to migrant workers because they are deemed essential. But yet still, they were denied hazard pay and denied so many things, which I'll get into. So what are the 3 pillars of the program? 1, we are here to do jobs Canadians don't want to do. What are the branches? We cannot apply for status. From the very foundation of Canada, Canada is using unjust immigration and unjust labor laws from the Chinese railroad workers. Canada continue to use those unjust immigration and unjust labor laws to work in tandem to keep migrant workers vulnerable and precarious. What are the leaves? We are tied to our employer by way of a tied work permit. Let me go over that program again. 1, we are tied to our employer. 2, to do the dirty jobs. And 3, denied status. In Canada, if you're denied status, it means that you're denied basic human rights and you are denied basic labor standards. To be tied to your employer, to do their dirty work, and at the same time denied basic human rights and basic labor standards. Is that the Canada? A while ago, I told you, red and white means love. Canada on the world stage tells the world that it's a country of love. It goes to the UN and tells the UN that the same rights and privileges that my citizens enjoy, I'll extend them to refugees. Canada goes to China and tells China, improve your human rights records. But yet still quietly, Canada perpetuates 18th century working conditions, which I'll get into in a short while. And again, I'll decide whether I'll punish you or whether I'll reward you, because you never told me about those injustices, and that is why I am in Canada. Now, before I get into those things that the pandemic exposed, I came to Canada not by choice. I was forced to come to Canada. Migrant workers do not come to Canada by choice, they're forced. If I come to Canada, any country that I visit freely, willingly, I'm a tourist, I'm a visitor. But migrant workers are not visitors, they're not tourists. They're forced to come to Canada. What are some of the things that forced me to come to Canada? GI, global inequality. Don't we have sufficient resources for everybody's need? Do we have enough for anybody's greed? And because of global inequality, the same work that I'm doing, I can do it in my home country, can't we? But because of global inequality, we are forced to come to Canada. Let me focus on Canada a little. Canada is estimated to have anything between 2/3 and 75% of the world's supply of fresh water. At this very moment, do you know how many communities are without that basic necessity? Is it a question of Canada not having water, or is it a question of how resources are used, abused, controlled, and misused? Another reason that forced me to come to Canada is ED, environmental destruction. I was forced to come to Canada because of a hurricane. Who are the countries causing global warming and climate change? Who are the ones paying the price? I was forced to come to Canada because of a hurricane. WTO, this is one of many institutions that creates that wide divide. So quickly, let me go and tell you about the pandemic. There are 20 injustices in my telephone number. Because of time, I'll not be able to get into it. But because of the Unjust program, there are 20 injustices that migrant farm workers face in Canada. 20. I cannot get into all of them, but I'll focus on one of them for now, housing. Our 4 simple things about our housing. 1, it is overcrowded. 2, it is isolated. 3, it is usually not regulated. Most times it's below standard. Look at the first element, it is isolated. And the second one, overcrowded. Isn't that the recipe for COVID to spread like wildfire? Is it surprising that it is estimated that over 3,000 migrant farm workers were infected with COVID in this province, Ontario? How did that affect us? In so many ways. 1, as I said, I like the way somebody put it, COVID has exposed Canada's dirty secrets. And what are they? What are the dirty secrets? 1, that migrant farm workers' condition is way below standards. It is not really regulated. It is overcrowded. Now, here we are. 1, because of the pandemic, mainstream media was forced to change their agenda. You never hear the stories of migrant workers in mainstream media. That's one thing that the pandemic, it forced mainstream media to change their agenda. So the cameras were forced to highlight the issues that migrant workers face. And what are the issues? That farm workers, migrant farm workers, their liberty were restricted. The farmers had them to sign documents to restrict their liberty. What does that say? What does that say? Are we treated as humans? And as I said, being denied status in Canada, it means that you're denied basic human rights and basic labor standards. We were forced to restrict our movements, our freedom was restricted by the farmers. Why? Because we don't have status. And it was only after the fact, and as a result of our lobbying, that the government came up with a vulnerable workers permit. Vulnerable, those workers who were in vulnerable situation can apply for a vulnerable workers permit. But What is the point of having a vulnerable workers permit when the whole program is unjust? To be tied to your employer without basic human rights, without basic labor standards to do that, isn't that a vulnerable program? Doesn't that make us, can't you see that as a gift to farmers? Other issues during quarantine, farm workers, migrant farm workers are denied access to culturally appropriate food. Culturally appropriate food. To be denied culturally appropriate food, what is that doing to your health? What is that doing to our health? Isn't that making our immune system even weaker and making us even more susceptible to that major disease, that virus? That is during quarantine. During the periods on the farm, as I just told you, that our freedom were restricted. We were restricted, prevented from going out and accessing culturally appropriate food during the time that we were working. Can you imagine that? In addition to being denied the opportunity to access culturally appropriate food, we were also denied the opportunity to send monies through Western Union and other means to our families, which is the main reason why we are here in Canada. Why are we here in Canada? Because we find ourselves between a rock and a hard place. In our home countries, unemployment is high. In our home countries, the developed countries, even including Canada, they have companies that drive us off the land through mineral extraction, through so many things, pollution and so on. They drive us, they cause displacement, they force us out of the land, they force us to come to Canada. Through the activities of developed countries, there are hurricanes and natural disasters that literally forced us out of our land. As I said a while ago, the WTO forced people from the land. The World Trade Organization, the IMF, and so many countries, international organizations, literally they create that wide divide. They forced us away from the land. Now that we come to Canada and thinking that we come into greener pastures to help our family, we face 20 injustices. So we're caught between a rock and a hard place. That is what COVID has exposed. What other things that COVID has exposed? That the program, the seasonal agriculture workers program, like most of the temporary foreign workers program, they are employer driven. They do not want to hear from the workers. And that is clearly highlighted during COVID. During COVID, the mainstream media were forced to highlight it. But did you hear it from the horse's mouth? Did you hear the conditions that the workers speak, the conditions from the workers' mouth? No. Why? Because there's so much fear built into that program. And that is what COVID has exposed. That the program is fear, there's a lot of fear built in it. A while ago, I told you that red and white means love. Canada on the world stage portrays itself as a country of love, but yet still Canada have that program and so many other programs that has fear built into it. And let me give you one example of how fear is built into it. And that is one of the injustices that we face, that there's so much power in the hands of our employees. They control the travel agency that books our flight in and out of Canada. The moment you speak up or you're a troublemaker, they get a flight to book you. They book a flight to send you back home. And that is highlighting how much there's so much, this high power imbalance. A while ago, I told you, 1 minute the borders were closed and open only to citizens and permanent residents. And next minute, the Prime Minister changed it, opened the borders to migrant farm workers. Who are the ones lobbying the government? Who are the ones? Who are the politicians loyal to? And that's what the COVID is exposing. Who are the ones the politicians are loyal to? You, the voter, me, the worker, or their donors. And that is what COVID has highlighted, that there's so much power in the hands of our employees. And in closing, because of time, I want to tell you, basically, the program is designed, all the stakeholders are basically exploiting migrant workers. So we have been milked from every angle by every stakeholder. And I want to tell you, the 20 injustices that migrant workers face, the only remedy, the only one thing, the only Advil, the only Tylenol that can take care of most of those 20 injustices is status. And as I said, without status, we are denied basic human rights. Without status, we are denied basic labor standards. But with status, it will help us to take care of both our labor and immigration vulnerabilities. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Gabriel. So next, I'm going to ask Pam Frake, who is coordinator with Fight for 15 and Fairness, who is going to speak about the fight for decent work and lessons of 15 and fairness.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And Gabrielle, thank you so much for your incredible introduction. What a tough act to follow, but thank you. Maybe I'll just start by drawing from some of the things that you talked about, Gabrielle, about the way that the laws of the land are structured to restrict the agency of workers. And I think it's important, you know, Gabrielle talked about how the immigration laws are structured to prevent workers from having, you know, the ability to change employers. The immigration laws are structured to create 2 tiers of rights within our country, which makes it more difficult for workers to access basic employment standards, basic social supports, and so forth. So all of these things, the way the laws are structured, the system is not neutral. It's structured in order to disadvantage and constrain the agency of workers, while at the same time it's designed to empower employers and the role of the state. And so I think, you know, and then when you add, that's just a general observation, when you layer into that racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, xenophobia, and so forth, Islamophobia, all the oppressions that exist, you can imagine how the laws wind up harming workers who face systemic discrimination in a you know, how it harms them most in terms of how the system actually operates. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do in the Fight for 15 and Fairness is to actually try to start to address some of the laws, but in some ways the fight to change the laws to try to create more agency for workers is really the struggle to build a strong working class movement that that will eventually have the ability to, you know, hopefully someday impose its will on the employers. And in order for us to build that strong multiracial internationalist movement, it really means that we have to put anti-racism and anti-oppression practices at the very center and in the very details of every single thing we do in the movements. So, you know, we talk about, for example, how the laws can, you know, impact workers of color more specifically, but you know, or more particularly, but I think it's also worth really taking a moment to unpack it. So I'll give you an example. In Ontario, there is, you know, there's no provision for employers to have a good reason to fire a worker. If you're in a unionized environment, usually there's a just cause provision. But if you're not a worker in a unionized environment, an employer can more or less fire you for no reason whatsoever. So imagine how that impacts Black workers. Imagine how that impacts Indigenous workers. The arbitrariness that is handed over to employers has an even deeper impact on workers in those circumstances. Let's take the example of paid sick days, since that's obviously something that we have been working on for some time, and has a fair amount of support in Ontario right now. And in fact, I think it's, you know, almost 90% support of the, you know, of those surveyed believe that paid sick days are absolutely crucial. And yet when you look at who has access to paid sick days already, it's by and large, it's workers in higher incomes, it's workers in better jobs, and by and large, white workers have more access to paid sick days. And that in itself is obviously unjust, but then let's think about it one step even more deeply. Imagine, and actually the lower your wages, the less likely it is that you're gonna have access to paid sick days. And so think about what this means, you know, obviously injustice of it all, obviously the amount of people who are gonna go to work sick no matter what, and obviously that's a problem during COVID. But think about it under quote unquote normal circumstances. Imagine if, you know, we can all think of the times that we've maybe had to be off work. If we're lucky enough to be paid for that day, we don't really think about it. But imagine if you're an average worker that has to take, you know, say 3 days of unpaid sick days a year. That means you're losing anywhere, you know, hundreds of dollars every year in income. And so it has a disproportionate effect on the growing equity gap between racialized workers and non-racialized workers. So, and again, even if we think about questions about the gender wage gap, we can think about this, the systemic nature of the employment laws that contribute to those facts. So it's not merely the fact that a man and a woman will come into a workplace and the man will get, and the woman will get the same job and the man will be paid more. It's more like the underneath structures that are operating. So, you know, women and racialized workers, for example, are more likely to work for part-time. And because the law allows two people doing the same job, one part-time, one full-time, to be for the part-time worker to be paid much less and to not have the same benefits, it means that those workers in those positions earn less money over time, and so forth. And we can think about temp agency workers and so forth. And even in unionized environments, it's actually quite shocking to learn the huge differentials that exist between full-time workers and part-time workers. And even on the question of paid sick days, I have to say, even for myself, I was absolutely flabbergasted to learn that there are frontline unionized healthcare workers that don't have paid sick days in this province. Why? Because they're part-time. And when you're part-time, you don't, it's very often the case that you don't get the paid sick days and so forth. So this is just, again, to pause, to think about how the laws not only are unfair and unjust, but actually operate over time systematically to put Black workers, Indigenous workers, workers of color, newcomer workers, and so forth at a permanent disadvantage, therefore reinforcing structural racism in society at large. So what is the lesson for us in the Fight for 15 and Fairness movement, I think, is to really make sure that we center anti-racism and anti-racist practices, and that we're making the links between what's happening to workers inside the workplace and outside the workplace. I think when we do that, we have a much greater chance of building the kind of multiracial working class movement that is going to be much stronger and less susceptible to divide and conquer tactics that employers advance. And that's important because one of the things we've also learned is that even though it's very important when unionized workers are able to win improvements in collective bargaining and working conditions, wages, and so forth, what we've actually learned, you know, in practice through lived experience is that if there's not also a strategy to make sure that the bottom, those at the bottom of the working class hierarchy are brought along, there's no guarantee that just because the wages and, you know, of unionized workers increase, that actually the wages for the most vulnerable workers are going to increase. And we only have to look at, you know, experiences in Ontario or even south of the border, where in the United States, for example, the minimum wage hasn't been adjusted in more than 20 years. It's absolutely shocking, despite wage improvements among sections of the unionized working class. And so there's two things that I think are important to say about this. And one is, well, that as long as the bottom of the wage floor, or the working condition, the floor of wages and working conditions, is not being shored up and is not being fortified to make sure that everyone, all boats are rising, it actually makes it more and more difficult for unions to win demands. And I'll give you an example, for example, around the fight for paid sick days. You know, when we launched our Fight for 15 and Fairness and put the demand for at least 7 paid sick days on the agenda, it was at a time when most of the public discourse was about how are we going to take paid sick days away from those greedy, entitled public sector workers. You know, how many paid sick days do teachers have? How many paid sick days do you know, public servants have? How many paid sick days do nurses have, and so forth? And so that was predominantly the conversation. And actually there was a number of concessions that were extracted from unionized workers because there hadn't been until then a sort of a serious campaign to put the idea of paid sick days for all front and squarely on the agenda. And there's just so many examples of that. But now what is so exciting about how we've been able to turn the conversation around is that when we do lead on class issues, it's amazing how much popularity and how much support can be won. And that's also important because if we only measure our audience in terms of, you know, how people voted, for example, and if we focus mostly on how people vote, and that's our measure for whether people are progressive or not progressive, we miss an opportunity to pull people into a struggle where their ideas about who best represents them in the electoral arena, we miss an opportunity to convince them about what is in their interests. And again, I'll give you an example in Ontario where we had, people will recall, or maybe some of you will recall, we had this incredible experience in Ontario where the Fight for 15 and Fairness, was able to build a strong movement between union and non-union workers, and we were able to win a number of very important changes to employment law. And so Bill 148, some of you may know it, was under the Liberal minority government previously that actually, for all the years of them saying no, 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 no on the question of the $15 minimum wage, and that, people laughing at how ambitious a goal that was when we first launched, suddenly their no turned into yes, and here's how it's going to happen. And the minimum wage was supposed to go up to 15 in 2019. They implemented equal pay for part-time and full-time and their full-time counterparts, which had an impact on college faculty, which had an impact on temp agency workers, which had an impact even on unionized environments where built into the contract, if there are wage differentials between two people doing the same job, one full-time, one part-time, the law would have superseded that and actually given a really big boost to those projects. There were scheduling improvements. There's all kinds of improvements that we were able to win through this incredible fight. And that was an exhilarating experience. But we also learned that, unless we're constantly building our strength and constantly fortifying our movement, it's also possible to see some of those gains get rolled back. And I'll just share with you the experience we had going into the last provincial election, where when we were phoning people who had been on the front lines with us, campaigning for, paid sick days and for minimum wage increases and so forth. And we were talking to them about the election, about who's going to roll back the minimum wage and so forth. People actually had really big illusions in Doug Ford. They had very big illusions. They thought that Doug Ford was indeed the candidate of the little guy. People thought because the labor laws had been put in place and there's all sorts of legitimate anger against the Liberals for their years of budget cuts and neoliberalism and so forth, it was a situation where workers thought that Doug Ford was going to be the guy. It's like, we're going to have more jobs, we're going to have more health care, we're going to end hallway medicine, we're going to have more subways, we're going to have buck a beer. And however much people poo-poo those ideas, those, for people who don't follow politics very closely, that is actually, not a terribly unattractive platform. And especially firing the $6 million hydro guy, that had a certain working class appeal. And so when we were trying to convince supporters of 15 and Fairness, ordinary working class people who wanted all the things we've been fighting for, that Doug Ford was not the guy that's going to do that, we had a very difficult time persuading that. And after the election, we decided that we were going to go into those communities that voted for Doug Ford in the Etobicoke North, where there's strong working class communities. And in the lead up to try to put pressure on the Ford government to not roll back our labor laws, we had all these conversations with workers in those communities. And we were saying, it's like, sign this petition. This may be the first time ever we're asking you to sign a petition that's calling on the government to do nothing, basically hands off our labor law. And people said, oh, we were trying to explain the big business lobby is putting pressure on the government to roll things back. And people said, no, 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 Doug Ford will stand up for us. But through that experience of going in week after week after week, when Doug Ford, as we all knew was going to happen, when Doug Ford, basically did eventually roll back many of the gains we had won, those same workers we were in dialogue with were absolutely devastated, absolutely devastated. And then they came back. How did you know? What was it that he was saying? And then it was possible to engage in those conversations. But if we merely took a dismissive attitude to any working class person who had, accidentally voted for Ford, we would have missed a chance to build a strong working class movement. And I think that's the thing to be said, is whenever there's a clear class demand put at the fore, we win people to that. That is certainly the case around paid sick days, where there's so much popularity for paid sick days right now in the present time, that there's now reports about a little bit of a crisis happening inside the Conservative caucus, where people, Conservative MPs are hearing from their constituents about, about why they're not moving forward on paid sick days in the middle of the world's worst, pandemic yet. So that's a question. Another example, some of you following American politics, Florida. Florida was a Trump state, but it was also a state that voted to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And again, that's the thing. If we can lead with strong class demands, with the pathway to struggle, that's going to build a stronger movement, and it's going to allow us to expose the politicians that try to capture the interests of workers, but do it in but for illicit purposes, if you will. And that's the part, I think, why it's so important to, again, to center anti-racism in these struggles, and to make sure that we have a class movement that represents the interests of all. The last couple of points I'm going to make in the time that I have left is just the question about how we arrive at these demands, because I'll just say, and I get to say this because I'm speaking to an academic class, but we were on the receiving end of a certain amount of grief from a number of active academics who really thought that who ironically at first thought our demands were over the top, but then later became to feel that our demands were not adequate enough. And I wanted to talk a little bit about something that I've really learned. You can have an intellectual understanding of something, but I think learning it for yourself is a really exciting process, and learning it deeply and over and over and over again, is that what the demands of the Fight for 15 and fairness were established through conversations with workers in low wage and precarious work. And it was to them that we looked to identify what are the most urgent issues, what are the most pressing issues, what are the demands that you want to fight for. And what we learned in this process is that the demands that workers want to fight for aren't merely the best demands, objectively. Who wouldn't want a $30 an hour minimum wage or a $25 an hour minimum wage? There's also a subjective question here. And it's a question about what do workers feel is possible to win at any given moment. And that, if there isn't a tradition of solidarity, if we don't have strong social movements, what people feel is possible is shaped by that. And so sometimes workers don't have the confidence. Gabrielle talked a lot about fear, and there's real fear even among workers who have full citizenship status, because of the labor market is so precarious right now. So how do we build people's confidence? And that happens when we build these strong working class movements. When we first launched the campaign to raise the minimum wage many years ago now, it was after the demand was $14 now. And it was after the minimum wage in Ontario had been frozen at $10.25 for 4 full years. And at that point, we went back to workers, and workers decided they wanted to fight for 14. Now, what was interesting is that just as the Fight for 14 launched here, the Fight for 15 launched in the United States almost simultaneously. Our first hurdle, we were able to get the minimum wage from $10.25 to $11, and then we were able to win. A bump to $11 an hour, but we were also able to win a cost of living adjustment. And I'll just take 1 minute to talk about how important that advancement was, because many collective agreements now in Canada don't have cost of living adjustments. So we were able to win that demand then, but when we went back to workers to say, okay, what do you want to do in the next phase of the campaign? Workers, do you want to just, say, great, we got our, 75-cent victory and our cost of living adjustment, and we're going to go home? No, workers were inspired by both their own success, and they were inspired by the success of the Fight for 15 that had just had a huge breakthrough in SeaTac, a suburb of Seattle. And so inspired by that movement and inspired by our own organizing success, workers had the confidence to say, okay, now we want to go for 15. And that's what helped to launch the Fight for 15 and fairness. And the fairness piece, of course, was because there was a big labor law review, and we wanted to make sure that we put as big and bold an agenda as possible, as defined by workers, on the table for this labor law review. So just to say that having, if we don't ask workers what they want to fight for, generally what we get is a situation where if people agree with the demands, it's like if we'd said, $25 an hour, workers would have said, wow, yeah, I'd like $25 an hour, good luck with that, and let me know when you get there. But if we really want workers themselves to be at the heart of the movement, you have to find that sweet spot where the demand is both exciting enough to fight for and to actually reorganize your life to be part of the struggle, but also that aren't so low that that is to be bland and boring. So you want demands that seem both achievable and exciting to fight for. And if we and that's, you can only really arrive at that in conversation. And on that note, I'm happy to say that for the last year, we got a little bit blown off course by COVID, but for the last year, we've been engaging in literally hundreds of conversations with workers to find out from them what they want the next phase of the decent work movement to be. And so we're just in the process of having the last of the conversations and assessing the feedback that we've received so far. And we're preparing to relaunch the decent work movement on May 1st, where we're going to have refresh some of the demands, where we're going to be adding some of the demands that maybe were not as visible in the last round, but are now, more central. And it may be a continuation of the demands that we still need to fight for. But in any case, I can't wait myself to find out what minimum wage demand that workers want to fight for, because even though we didn't quite get our $15 target, we're at $14.25, which, to be honest, was a 23% increase for minimum wage earners. And I'll put that against any union collective bargaining processes any day. So I think that in itself was a success. But what we all know is that, when we get at one thing, we want to put it in our pockets and keep fighting for more. So we're going to find out what's the next target that workers would like to fight for in terms of the minimum wage. And we're going to find out what the demands are around paid sick days and all of those kinds of things. And we're going to look forward to building an even stronger decent work movement that has links not just to union and non-union workers in Ontario, but hopefully that can inspire the kinds of movements that are at the forefront of workers all around the world. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Pam. So finally, I would like to introduce David Mcnally, and I believe that many people watching in will remember David from York University, but they'll also remember him from his activism in the broader community within Toronto. David is now teaching at the University of Houston. So he's going to speak on, can the labour movement reinvent itself for an era of crisis and austerity? So I note in passing that David is not predicting a golden age of Keynesianism coming up soon. Over to you, David.
Thanks so much, John, for that introduction. And thanks as well to Ethel, who introduced the session and reminded us of the ways in which we are commemorating my late colleague, Leo Panich. I think that's very important and appropriate. And thanks, of course, to Gabrielle and to Pam for their remarks in terms of framing this discussion. Now, in addressing the question, can the labor movement reinvent itself? I'm going to frame my remarks by reading briefly to you two recent headlines, one from a left-wing publication and one from a very mainstream business publication. The left-wing publication, Jacobin magazine, ran an article recently under the headline, "American Workers Aren't Striking." Within a matter of days, the Financial Times ran an article with the headline, "Trade Unions Are Back After a Long Absence." And essentially, as I say, I want to frame my remarks around these, because if we ask ourselves who's right, Jacobin magazine or the Financial Times, I'm going to suggest to you that actually both are right on different levels. But this situation can't hold. That is to say, you can't have an enduring period of time in history, and particularly in the history of labor and social movements, in which there's very, very little organized struggle, but the institutions and organizations make a comeback. So let's put this in context. American unions and American workers aren't striking. In 1950, the labor board in the US recorded 400 major strikes. Last year, 2020, they recorded 7 major strikes. That's the basis for the claim that American workers aren't striking. And it's not a uniquely American problem. Across the whole of the 20 countries that comprise the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, this is mainly the large, mainly Western developed capitalist countries, including Canada, the United States, most of Western Europe, and so on. Across those countries, since 1985, trade union membership has dropped by 1/2. Trade union membership dropped by 1/2 at a time where the workforce almost doubled. So we're talking about a dramatic decline in what's sometimes called union density. That is to say, the actual organized presence of unions within workplaces, and obviously also within the broader society where they exercise or potentially can exercise a significant social and political influence. Okay, if that's the case, then I'll submit to you that this long decline, I've taken 1985 for these stats, but it essentially coincides with what we've come to call the neoliberal offensive against labor, social movements, and working class communities. And quite often we treat a number of key political defeats for labor movements as emblematic of the rise of neoliberalism. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's defeat of the National Union of Mine Workers in the mid-1980s, Ronald Reagan's crushing of a strike by the Air Traffic Controllers Union in the United States, or the Bolivian government's huge defeat of arguably the most militant mass union in Latin America, the Tin Miners Union, who they militarily crushed in 1985. These were all turning points, and the model of business unionism, that is to say, the model that assumes that full-time professional trade union officials and negotiators can, in dialogue with the state and employers, win consistent improvements for workers. That's the classic model of business unionism. It's not mobilization from below. It's not membership mobilization and struggle. Those are called upon in kind of orchestrated ways if necessary, but central to the business union model is that professional negotiators accountable to full-time officials can, in conversation and dialogue with employers and government, win gains. That model has been in severe crisis now since at least the mid-1980s. Okay, so when I give that context, how can there be any truth to the claim that trade unions are back after a long absence, which this Financial Times journalist asserts? And I think not without reason. Let's start at the level of attitudes and social consciousness. Since 2009, you see in one jurisdiction after another, and by the way, 2009, as many of you know, marked a global financial crisis. And you see since then, as I say, in one jurisdiction after another, a shift pretty decisively in public attitudes towards unions. In 2009, only 48% of those polled in the US expressed favorable opinions, attitudes, and support towards unions. Last year, the percentage was 65%. In other words, over the last decade or slightly more, there's been a significant and marked rebound in the public image of unions, in the support for unions. And these numbers are significantly higher among African Americans, among young workers in the United States, and so on. But it's not just new attitudes. There are several other areas in which you can see a return of a certain kind, and I do want to emphasize that, a certain kind of labor organizing. And I'll give you a few examples and then try to draw some larger conclusions from this. Let me take the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain. It's an interesting case because the Independent Workers' Union of Great Britain does not negotiate collective agreements. I want to pause there and say it again. They do not negotiate collective agreements, but they have led strikes. This means that they're largely working outside the channels of ordinary, legalized, bureaucratized collective bargaining. Instead, they're organizing workers who often have engaged in workplace actions. Their roots are in migrant worker organizing. But a week ago, they organized a strike of minicab drivers in London, England, over safety issues. These are direct actions by workers putting pressure on employer organizations, but outside the process of collective bargaining, simply by using the strike weapon to make demands. Some of you may be reminded of the mobilization of New York taxi drivers against Trump's so-called Muslim ban early on in Trump's presidency. Again, not about collective bargaining, but a form of strike action, in this case also by drivers. And people in this discussion, like Gabrielle and Ethel, will know that domestic workers and farm workers in the United States, Canada, and beyond have often organized in these ways. And we need to remind ourselves that when Marx and Engels were writing about trade unions, for instance, in the 19th century, these were unions that struck, organized, had memberships, but didn't actually have collective agreements. So the idea that part of the reinvention of the labor movement could happen outside the traditional channels of collective bargaining needs to be taken quite seriously. And with that in mind, I want to say a few words about the potentially game-changing organized campaign, actually campaigns going on at Amazon in the US. The most important of these is in Bessemer, Alabama. And to many people, that seems like a non sequitur because the image of the South as white and conservative tends to ignore the fact that the US South tends to have the largest Black populations proportionately, especially in and around large cities like Birmingham, Alabama, for instance, which has been a historic hub of the left and the civil rights movement. And Bessemer is essentially just outside Birmingham. They are practicing in this drive aspects of what has historically been called civil rights unionism. That is to say, the organizing drive is as much a form of anti-racist organizing as it is workplace organizing. They are emphasizing along the kinds of lines that you can hear in both Gabrielle and Pam's presentations, the interconnection of anti-racist and union organizing. Now, having said that, it's a campaign with a lot of shortcomings. It's going to raise interesting questions about organizing models. The retail wholesale department store union that's leading the campaign, and this would organize about 6,000 Amazon workers in Bessemer. The retail wholesale department store union has decided to go the traditional route of winning union recognition through the National Labor Relations Board. And that creates all kinds of problems, in part because the employer is able, over the month-long voting process, to send texts and email messages regularly to workers opposing the union. Amazon is sending them 4 to 5 messages a day. They can put up posters on company property opposing the union drive. They can, as they have, introduce a whole series of programs to get workers to voluntarily leave with a small bonus. In other words, it gives the employer a huge amount of room for direct intervention into the process. And interestingly, the Amazon union drive in Iowa that's happening right now, Teamster organizers on the ground, and I want to emphasize they don't fully have the support of all of the Teamster leadership at this point, but the Teamster organizers on the ground in Iowa want to go for a recognition strike rather than going through the bureaucratic process with the National Labor Relations Board. That is to say, they want to organize to the point where they simply strike and force the employer to sign a contract recognizing the Teamsters as the representative of the workers. That's a tactic that was much more common in the first half of the 20th century, peaked in the 1930s and 40s. And so I emphasize this because we're seeing elements of older, more militant, direct action kinds of tactics emerging around Amazon. That is to say, civil rights unionism, at least elements of that in the Alabama campaign, and direct action by way of strikes for recognition in terms of one of the possibilities of the Iowa Teamsters campaign. All of this brings me to some final comments around a theme that I've called in a piece I've written, the return of the mass strike. Because when you get statistics saying that strike levels are low, very often what you discover is that what's being recorded are official legal strikes conducted in and around ordinary collective bargaining. But the truth is, we have seen a whole variety of mass strikes in one country after another that often go right outside those channels. So let me take, for instance, probably the high point of mass strikes throughout 2020, Chile. These were strikes that began as a result of a mass campaign of young people in Santiago against transit fare increases. This was a hugely militant campaign. It eventually even involved the burning down of transit stations at various points, but it inspired strikes by dock workers, miners, teachers, nurses, private manufacturing sector workers, and so on. And key to the strike organizing were thousands and thousands of activists who had been organized through feminist strikes in Chile over the last several years. You see similar dynamics in France in the strikes that peaked with mass uprisings in the streets in December of 2020 before COVID hit. We see it as well with a whole number of large strikes and mass actions in India, now, of course, most significantly in terms of the farmers' protests. And at the moment in Myanmar, garment workers are leading a whole series of strikes against the military. None of these are happening through the traditional collective bargaining process. These have all generally been mass outpourings of strike action inspired by social and political contestation, often initially kicked off by feminists, young people fighting back against transit fare increases, and so on. In fact, in terms of historic reference points, they look much more like the dynamics of the mass strikes in Russia in 1905 and 6, analyzed by Rosa Luxemburg at the time. Now, I run through all of this because I'm trying to emphasize that there is a traditional post-World War II model of collective bargaining-based union organizing, which has been consistently losing ground throughout the neoliberal period. But labor movements have often reinvented themselves. Here where I am in the United States right now, the labor movement was reinvented in the 1930s through the sit-down strike. The classic methods of the American Federation of Labor had led to dramatic declines in union organization, union support, and capacities. It took new tactics. It took a new generation of activists, militants, and organizers who were prepared to experiment with things like the sit-down strike, to begin to organize largely immigrant workforces in mass industries. It meant reinventing the movement, reinventing its tactics, although note that many of the reinventions are also forms of rediscovery. I've talked about recognition strikes. I've talked about civil rights unionism, and so on as examples. Many of these things actually resuscitate, revive, develop, and extend older, more militant forms of working class organizing. And the final point I'll make on this is that everything we know about labor and working class history says that struggle happens in waves. It takes a series of breakthroughs. In the US, it was 3 successful militant strikes in 1934 that then peaked with the sit-down strikes at General Motors in 1937, which then drove a whole wave of organizing. Once you get a significant breakthrough, maybe it will be Bessemer, Alabama at the end of this month, then you can unleash a whole wave of struggle. But for that to happen, I believe that the methods of the past are going to be inadequate, and that the labor movement is going to need to reinvent itself in the sorts of ways I've been describing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, David. So I have a question actually for each of the panelists that's come through. I mean, 3 different questions for each of the panelists. So I'm going to start with you, Gabrielle. It says, can you provide us with any thoughts about or examples of how migrant agricultural workers exercised agency within the restrictive framework with which they find themselves? So how have migrant workers, how have migrant organized within the restrictions that are imposed upon them?
Thank you. That's a powerful question. Nice question. Being a migrant worker, a migrant farm worker, as you can see, is very restrictive. Our hands are tied, our mouths are kept shut. So we are literally find ourselves in a difficult situation. However, that is where creativity comes in, and we do creative organizing. I didn't have time to go through the 20 injustices that we face, but Pam touched a lot of them. And what are some of them? It is illegal for migrant farm workers to unionize. Illegal for us to unionize. And even Pam told you a while ago that even even citizens of Canada and unionized workers, they find themselves in difficult situations or they don't speak up. So you can imagine how creative we have to be in order to fight back. And what are some of the ways? A while ago, I showed you a bandana. And that is one of the creative tools that we use, that the farm workers would use it to both participate, but at the same time disguise themselves. That is just one creative way. I'm so happy because of the pandemic, now we can use a mask, although we have to be physically distant. So that's a good way of being creative, right? They can participate, but it's difficult to recognize. Other important things, in 2016 was the 50th anniversary of the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program. As I said, it is 54 years old this year. And during that time, we marched and caravan across southwestern Ontario all the way to Ottawa. And we stopped in 20 cities and so on. And that was one way of connecting with workers. So we did that creatively. And at the same time, we connected with our allies and even Pam. That was the first time I met Pam, because these are the things that unite us, right? That is the creative way. 15 and fairness. That it is campaigns that unites us. So we we have been creative in the way that we're able to get workers to come to the front. We're able to be creative and connect with our allies, 15 and Fairness being one of them. We have been able to connect with other workers like the living caregivers. We have been really creative through the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change. We're able to be creative. We're able to connect with other workers and other like-minded organizations across Canada. So we've been very creative. And some of the wins, and I'm telling you, that's a powerful thing about our fight. Our fight is not a natural, we're not trying to change natural laws and natural things. No, we are changing human-made stuff. And PPP, you can never forget that, PPP. Our poverty is because of the unjust policies of the politicians. And how do we get to the politicians? By using people power. And we connect with people. And you can never forget, how do we connect with people? How do we connect with people? There are various ways. And some of our friends and allies, they've done things that are reducing the barriers. What I say reducing the barriers, some people do documentaries, some people do use creative art. So it makes it easy for people to participate and get the word around. We do it in really creative ways. I cannot tell you all of them. We are still searching for creative ways to be more impactful, to reach more people. So if you have more ideas, but we have tons, and we have tons, lots and lots of small victories under our belt. And that's an amazing thing. And as Pam said, and we all know, with people power, the victory, the victories are gradual, but we hope they're cumulative, because the more people that get involved, the more people that we get involved, the more people become aware that the more, and that is the purpose. That's why I'm so happy to be here. Are you concerned? It is said, and we all know that, the food that you eat can be your safest form of your medicine. The food that you eat can also be the slowest form of your poison. The question is, and that is why I'm happy to be here, are you concerned whether your food is being grown by those who respect the soil, respect the environment, and respect the workers? Or are you not concerned whether they exploit the soil, exploit the environment, exploit the workers? And the more Canadians become concerned about that, the more happier we are. And we keep on coming up with creative ways to get that message around, so that you pressure your politicians. What are the politicians saying? Oh, that's not an issue in my riding. So if your food is important to you, and if staying home, like during COVID, we encourage to stay home, and you're concerned about how reliable your food supply is, then you pressure your politicians. You ask your friends, your family, your co-workers, you tell them, you let them know about the injustices that we face, and to pressure the politicians to change those unjust laws, unjust policies, and create a fair society. I hope I answered that question, right?
You did. Thank you, Gabriel. And now I have a question for Pam that has come in. It said, last week there were reports in the news that improving PSW wages in long-term care homes has a negative effect on visiting home care services because staff are leaving the field for better wages in LCT homes. What should be done about this?
Thanks very much for the question. And I think in some ways that really illustrates exactly why when you raise the floor of wages and working conditions, and if you give workers more choices in the labor movement, it has the effect of putting pressure on employers. The irony around the way the state intervenes to put its finger on the scales against workers by creating laws that prevent them from joining unions, or creating laws that deny them access to their entitlements under the employment standards, and so forth, is that it's a way of intervening to prevent the so-called free market from being able to express itself. So, for example, I mean, I think the obvious question is that the wages of personal support workers are so shockingly low. And that's a function of the fact that the minimum wage is shockingly low. And so it's hard for workers, even when they're unionized, to get wages up. So imagine what would happen if we had won a $15 minimum wage, or what if we won a $20 minimum wage? How is that going to affect the wage floor? And I'll give you an example of a conversation I had with somebody who's a lifeguard, who's a member of, actually, interestingly enough, a member, young woman worker, member of CUPE, who objected to the idea of a $15 minimum wage, because she says, I have to save people's lives. Like, I have a very stressful job and I make $15 an hour. you're telling me that anybody who slings coffee is going to get the same wages that I'm going to get? I object to that. And I suggested to her that it's like, well, if I had a very stressful job and it only paid $15 an hour, I might go to what I mean, not saying that I've slung coffee before, that is not a non-stressful job, but I might suggest that a worker would leave the stressful job and go to the non-stressful job if it actually paid the same. And that's going to put pressure on those employers to raise wages. And if you look at what the business community freaked out about when we actually briefly had the labor law reforms, the whole package, is that there was an editorial in the Toronto Sun that basically said, with this bill 148, Kathleen Wynne has effectively unionized Ontario. And that was very telling, because what the employers were objecting to, it was not only that minimum wage earners were going to get a bump, but they knew perfectly well that that is going to have everyone else who's in and around the low end of the wage hierarchy are going to start asking for wage increases. And they were more class conscious than our side was to understand how that dynamic works. So it's not, so if it's not harming, it's not harmful to the workers. What your scenario reflects is the fact that personal support workers deserve a much higher minimum wage, as do almost all the essential workers deserve a much higher wage for what they're getting. And if we can raise the wage floor, it's going to make it more possible for other workers to fight for more. And what we say, over and over again in our movement, is like, you raise the floor of wages and working conditions from the bottom up, it allows unions to set the bar. So that would be my answer to that. And if I could just sneak in a little bit on Gabrielle's question, I wanted to share one other anecdote about farm workers. And some of you may recall that Dominion workers in Newfoundland and Labrador went on strike last August because they rejected their union's tentative agreement. They were and basically said, we want to make pandemic pay permanent. And so they went on strike for 12 weeks. And what was so phenomenal about that is that farm workers who saw themselves as obviously being part of the food chain, as Gabrielle has pointed out, sent a video. Like, the Fight for 15 and Fairness was trying to create a solidarity video from across the country to try and build as much public support for these workers. And the farm workers sent their own video because they saw themselves as part of the food chain along with the grocery store workers. We grow the food that they put on the shelves, and we are in solidarity with your strike. We hope your strike wins. And what was so brilliant about that is that so often the frame from people, from white workers, to be honest, the kind of racist frame of white workers is that newcomer workers or migrant workers, they need, they're victims, they don't have agency. And this turned the tables on that. It's where instead of asking for solidarity, they're giving solidarity. And it gave us a glimpse of how powerful a united working class movement could actually be. But I'll also just mention that the sad thing is that the Dominion workers didn't wind up winning their strike. And so going on strike, and a valiant strike, and the union did do all sorts of amazing tactics and the hot occupations and highway blockages and all of that. But what I think we're also faced with is this question of more and more sectional struggles are having a hard time winning. And I feel like part of reinvigorating the labor movement is actually reinvigorating those traditions of solidarity, where we start figuring out collective strategies. Because honestly, if every grocery store worker in this country that had massive support in Ontario, across Canada, had basically said, all for one and one for all, we're not doing anything until those Dominion store workers win their pay increase. And by the way, we want it too. And by the way, why don't you just put it into the minimum wage so we all get it? That could have galvanized a strong working class movement, made sure that those unionized workers could win, while also paving a way to raising the floor for everyone. And I feel like those are strategic questions that don't get enough attention on the part of the organized labor movement and the differently organized labor movement. Sorry, John, you're muted.
I'm so sorry. Okay, so questions coming for David is, how are unions updating their internal administrative processes to promote their own institutional vitality?
Sad to say, few are. There are, however, some important exceptions. And, one of the things I was trying to do in my remarks was to point to areas where we can see new kinds of practices that point in a different direction. Probably some of the unions which have done the best at what we might say democratizing themselves and moving towards real membership empowerment have been a couple of the large teachers unions, particularly in Chicago and in Los Angeles. So for those of you who don't know the backdrop, I mean, really, the Chicago Teachers Union has been crucial to the revitalization of teachers unionism, starting with their 2012 strike, because they struck overwhelmingly to defend schools and communities of color. That was overwhelmingly what their strike was about. And they rolled back school closures. As many of you know, schools are community and neighborhood hubs, particularly in poor, multiracial, working class communities. And if those institutions close their doors, the land gets sold off for housing development and so on. These have dire consequences beyond the educational ones, which are themselves very profound. And the Chicago Teachers Union was reinvented because a coalition of rank and file educators, as they called themselves, spent years doing community organizing against school closures and then won elections to the leadership of the Chicago Teachers Union. So it was a militant grassroots rank and file group of teachers who first did that work on the ground for years before they stood for union election. And based on the fact that they'd actually kept schools open, preserved jobs, and so on, they won. And they introduced, for me, some really important reforms, which I saw when I first came around the labor movement as a teenager in the 1970s. So that, for instance, you cannot have a contract settled just by agreement of the negotiating committee and the executive. It has to first go to a meeting of a House of Delegates, which is hundreds and hundreds of rank and file teachers who are not full-time officials of the union. You get delegates essentially coming from every school in every region. And if they vote down the collective agreement, it doesn't even go to the executive board. It has to go back to negotiations again. By the way, when I first got involved in strike support work with steel workers at a miners' strike in Inco in Sudbury in 1975, they had the same structure. It was called the Stewards Council, but if the Stewards Council didn't approve, the deal didn't go forward. This empowers membership activism. It means that grassroots rank and file organizing really matters throughout the whole of the collective bargaining process. And that kind of rebuilding of unions from below is what the Chicago Teachers Union did. And frankly, I believe very much the same thing with the Los Angeles Teachers Union. I mean, it's really interesting. The LA Teachers Union won, as did the Chicago Teachers Union. They've won things like housing allowances must be provided by the city to precariously housed students. In other words, this goes far beyond their direct collective bargaining. It's not the wages and benefits of the teachers. It's a demand that they're winning for the children in the community, that housing allowances will be provided to families that are precariously housed. And those kinds of anti-racist, anti-poverty demands that reach outside the workplace are crucial for what's sometimes been called social movement unionism. So it's those kinds of things which empower membership mobilization and grassroots and build connections inside the community, because labor organizing and striking takes on a much more working class community-based kind of framework.
Okay, thanks. With getting towards the end, I want to pose a question that I think each presentation has raised this in its own way. But what's essentially, I think, the situation is, it comes up with migrant workers who are outside of the norms of the forms of organising that have been available to workers, and it takes place in many contexts here. But the traditional model of responding to workers' needs has been the collective bargaining model that was created at the end of the Second World War, was developed after the Second World War. So we deal with a situation where worker struggles have been highly compartmentalized, and we've seen various attempts to break out of that. We see the days of action that occurred in the 1990s in Ontario, for example, and it seems to me that this situation of crisis is one that cries out for that to be taken forward much further than it's been. And so I'd ask each of you perhaps to respond to the question of how will this crisis potentially, and how can this crisis take us out of that compartmentalized model and into more generalized forms of working class resistance? I don't know who wants to go first, but jump in. You're muted. If you're speaking, Gabriel, you're muted.
Thanks for pointing that out. Okay. In this equation here, we have migrant workers find themselves in the middle of the equation. What's the equation? We have employers, we have unions, we have citizens, we have the government. And what does the employers want? Profit, profit, profit. And we know with neoliberalism, with capitalism, it's profit before people. How does the government keep employers happy? We will explore that in a while. The unions want, when there's a strike, that there's no pool of workers, undocumented workers or cheap labor. The unions want, when there's a strike for better conditions, that there's no pool of cheap workers that the employers can tap into to break the strike. The citizens, what do they want? They want racial purity. Now I've watered it down. I've sugar-coated it and say citizens. Who are the people who doesn't want people of color to be among them? How does the government keep all of these people happy? The government ensures that there's a cheap source of labor in the form of migrant workers. How does the government keep the unions happy? By ensuring that those migrant workers, they come to the jobs that are non-unionized. So the unions are happy. How are the citizens kept happy? By ensuring that migrant workers are kept on the farm isolated and invisible. So the government keeps everybody happy. How does the government keep itself happy? By we contributing to EI, for example, and we cannot access EI. So the government keeps all of these people happy. How, going back to the question I was asked, that was posed to me a while ago, earlier. 20 years ago, roughly 2 decades ago, migrant workers stood up in Leamington in a wildcat strike. And that caught the attention of people who were studying about food justice, social justice, diversity in the work. That caught the attention of people who studied that. And that caught their attention. So these people went to find out what is happening. And as a result of those migrant workers standing up for their rights, that started a movement. And the very group that I'm affiliated to, Justice for Migrant Workers, they were born as a result of migrant workers standing up for their rights. This year, there were 2 significant occasions where migrant workers stood up for their rights, and just one day of action, and people in the community stood in solidarity with them. They were able to gain success. Now, going back to the specific question, the government, the federal government that's in power, in the previous election, they got into office on what platform? Real change. That was the platform. What is the song that they're singing to you right now? The new reality. And what's the new reality? Short-term employment. That's what they're singing. Now, you as students, is that the kind of society we want? Short-term employment? And you know, a couple of years, not very long ago, there were so many strikes. The strikes are so frequent in colleges and universities, where because of short-term contract, you never know where you stand. At the end of your contract, what happens? Is that the kind of society we want? So unions are realizing that migrant workers are guinea pigs, that the same things they've tried on us, they're bringing it to mainstream employment. So now we are united. Now we are united. So unions now realize, oh, these are not a different department, and it is just migrant workers issue. No, these are labor issues. So now our unions, they're building solidarity with migrant workers and forming a united front. And that is where we've taken on the challenge that work is work, regardless of who is in it. Work is work. And when Pam said we're raising the minimum wage or raising the floor, that is what it is. It is work. Work is work. An injustice to one is an injustice to all. And with TPP and all those trade, even before NAFTA, it was said, if you look at the study of unionized labor, unionized work, unions, before NAFTA and after NAFTA, we noticed a dramatic decline. And and all of that is as a result of the trade talks and those trade policies and those neoliberal policies. They are not geared towards workers, and that's what makes us united. So already when we realize that it does not make sense fighting on our own, but united we can stand and fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you. I don't know which of you wants to go next. We only have 3 minutes left, but it's quite possible to go a couple of minutes over if that's okay with people. So who wants to speak next?
We can just keep the same order maybe that we spoke in, if that's
yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. And just building off what Gabrielle was saying, I think COVID in some ways has been a horrible tragedy, but it's also been a moment of reckoning. And I feel as though the appreciation of what work, what is essential work, it has really been redefined. And I was thinking about something Gabrielle said at the beginning of his talk about, the skilled workers that come back year after year after year in Canada to grow our food, and how when, I forget which federal politician was like, well, we'll just get unemployed people to do that work. And the farmers or the employers are like, what are you talking about? This is highly skilled work. This is, we can't just be anybody that does this. We need those workers to come in, whether it was for the greenhouses or the fields or the beekeeping. And who knew that, that bees actually move across the country and fertilize all the, do all the pollination of all the fruit-bearing plants across the country. But that recognition that these are not temporary and disposable workers, these are essential and skills building workers. So I do feel like there's a real opportunity for us to cut against the fragmentation. But I agree with you, John. I think the fragmentation and sectionalism of the labor movement, and in general, this conception of the working class movement, because I do feel like sometimes people focus merely on that section of the class that's officially organized into unions. And really, we miss all, as David was saying, all the different and experimental and creative forms of struggle that have been going on for years before even union density was declining. I'm thinking the, Domestic Workers Alliance. I'm thinking of all the kinds of exciting forms of organizations that actually exist. But I do think it also requires us to think quite deliberately and consciously about class demands, like and by class demands, I don't mean just issues around workers, but class demands around housing, class demands around, wages and working conditions, a vision where everyone can see themselves reflected in order for there to be a pathway in for everyone. But I do think sometimes what happens is, even amongst well-intended people, that, unions should have higher wages because, well, we've unionized. And I think sometimes there's this notion that we need union density for the purposes of union density, rather than understanding that workers will find unions useful when unions are engaged in struggle to raise wages and working conditions. And it's, I had this debate with somebody saying, the problem with the fight for 15 of fairness is that it's not demanding that everybody join a union. And I asked, well, what unions are trying to actually organize McDonald's workers, and what unions are actually trying to do this organizing work? Like, we'd love it if there was a union willing to do and take on this hard work. But the fact is that, it's hard to organize in precarious sectors, and the unions that are doing it are few and far between. And of course, they should be celebrated when they do. But I do think that having a mechanism to put forward class demands allows for two things. It allows for workers who are not in unions to find a way into leadership and activity, but it also does something else. It allows rank and file members of unions to find their way into struggles, because one other dynamic of the official structures of labor is that the people who have official positions, that's sort of like, you know, that's basically where it starts and ends. And there's very little informal structures. But if you can create mechanisms for rank and file workers to find their way into struggles that are related to the workplace, but not confined to the workplace, they develop leadership, they develop tools and skills that allows for the emergence of what you might call a rank and file network. It might not be quite the same, you know, conception of a rank and file network of shop stewards that, you know, we like to think back to, you know, from the, you know, whatever decades past, but we can begin to reconceptualize what does a rank and file network look like. And maybe it doesn't look like it did 30 or 40 years ago, but those connections between unions and between union and non-union workers is a way of forging solidarity and forging a leadership that does then have the potential to reinvigorate not just the labor movement, but the whole of the class struggle here and around the world.
Okay, and David.
Yeah, really, because what Gabrielle and Pam have said is so important, and I overwhelmingly agree with. I'll just sort of add kind of a historical point, which is I've talked about the organizing drive at Bessemer, Alabama at Amazon, which could be a game changer if they can win that. But there's a reason that it's happening in that area. And it has to do with the radical working class activists and organizers who sunk deep, deep roots in that area during the Great Depression. They were organizing sharecroppers. They were organizing miners. They were organizing forestry workers and steel workers, but they weren't focused overwhelmingly on their members. In other words, these unions spent more time fighting the Klan and driving them out of communities. They spent as much or more time doing voting registration with African American workers. They focused on all the conditions of life, and they made the union, quote unquote, which was organizing without collective bargaining rights, even though the workers, you know, had members in the hundreds and thousands who were paying union dues to keep some organizers in the field. But sometimes their biggest victories were they created whole towns that the Klan could not enter, for instance. Doing that in Alabama in the 1930s and 40s mattered, and the activists who were trained then built the civil rights movement from below in the 1950s. So we need a conception of unions again, as both Gabrielle and Pam have been talking about, that fight on every front of working class life and experience. And when we think of that as a labor movement, we really are talking about reviving the best of past traditions, but in light of a whole series of contemporary conditions.
Okay. Well, my thanks to everyone. Thanks to Ethel for the introductions. Thanks to each and every one of the panelists. They were individually great presentations, but the sum of the parts and all that. So I really, really appreciate everything. Next week, we will be back to talk about the question of basic income, whether it represents a progressive alternative or is it a mistake for social movements and for the left. We'll have that discussion next week. So thank you everyone for coming.